All right. I like that flow, having Joshua lead the prayer as we transition from Joshua to Ruth. Um, and I want to start out by thanking Scott Foster. I know he's not here, but thanking him for filling in last week. Lord willing, we will have a lesson at the end of class of the quarter where we'll kind of do a review of all the things that we learned in Joshua and Ruth, tie it all together. Tonight we're going to start in chapter 1 of the book of Ruth, and I'd like to. This is not the right slide deck. Oh, I may not have sent Matt the right slide deck. Do you have lesson 7, Matt? All right. Please hold. Your class is important to us. All right. It's going to take me a second. I apologize. If only I knew while I was standing around doing nothing. If you haven't read Ruth 1, you could be doing that right now. That might be a good idea. All right, email sent. Okay, so we'll just talk through it. We don't need to see it up on the screen. My opening question for discussion tonight is, how has hardship shaped your faith? This lesson is going to be all about hardship and what we can learn from Ruth and Naomi as it relates to having faith during troubling times. Anybody want to share how hardship maybe has shaped their faith? And if you don't want to do specifics, talk about, like, I know a guy. Will? Mm. Yeah. So let me ask you this. Do you think you could have learned those lessons another way, an easier way? You would certainly have designed it easier for yourself.
Exactly. I would have definitely designed it differently.
Yeah.
But if I had not, I would have
Yeah. Now that's good. I mean, look, I've spent a lot of time in my life thinking about what would I do different if I could go back in time? What would I change? You know, and then, but I'm at the point in my life now where I think if that thought pops into my head, I'm like, I don't actually want to change it because who I am has been shaped by that in such a way that I don't know if I would be where I am in my relationship with God if I hadn't experienced all the pain and suffering that I have in my life. Um, Anybody else have anything they want to share on this? Yeah, that's a really big part of it. I mean, and Will had that same sort of message. He talks about helping people now in a way different than before, right? That's a common theme when people talk about and share their hardships, is if you look to the Lord to get you through it, and there will probably be moments where you look away or you even try to run away, and we'll talk about that tonight. But if you stay with the Lord or return to the Lord, He's going to get you to a point where you realize, I'm actually more capable now than I was before. I can help people. My thing is, I don't want to waste any of my pain and trauma, right? I want to use it. Hmm. Yeah, that's absolutely right. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I've been there myself too. You know, it's one thing to know intellectually that we're supposed to count it all joy when we suffer. You don't really know what that means until you actually suffer. Right? This was great. I appreciate the conversation. Let's have more of that as we talk through the first chapter of Ruth. But let's go ahead and talk about famine and loss, which is kind of the backdrop for the story of Ruth. Who has verses 1 and 2? Mike? All right, there is so much information packed in these two verses. Um, it starts off with really bad PowerPoint animation. I'm just going to go ahead and put them all on there. I don't know what that was about. It starts off by saying, in the days when the judges ruled. The days when the judges ruled. And in the past, I read that and just went right past it and just didn't even think about it. Oh, that's chronology. That's like when it happened. Great. Good to know. Move on. What do we know about the time of the judges? It was a time of great wickedness. It says that in Judges 21:25 that in those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eye. This is the backdrop of the story of Ruth. And if you have any doubts about the wickedness that occurred during the Judges, read Judges 19. It's horrifying. I'm not kidding. It is horrifying. We will not read it tonight because it is horrifying. But if you want to read it, go home and read it and think to yourself, this is the condition of the land of Israel during the time that this story took place, right? It was a famine. And we know why there was a famine because in Leviticus 26 it says, if you walk in my statutes and observe my commandments and do them, then I will give you your rain in their season, and the land shall yield its increase, and the trees of the field shall yield their fruit. There was no rain because people were not obedient to God. They did whatever they wanted to do, whatever they thought was right. And so this is where we pick up the story with Elimelech, which always makes me start singing the Elimelech, Elimelech, Elimelech. But Elimelech, whose name means my God is king, is an Ephrathite. Anybody know what an Ephrathite is? Ephrath is another word for Bethlehem. It's the same area as Bethlehem. And Ephrath is a Hebrew word that means fruitful. And Bethlehem is the house of bread. It's really interesting to me that fruitful and bread in the beginning of this story about famine, right? So Elimelech leaves Israel and goes to Moab, which is an enemy of Israel, because there is no bread. The house of bread had no bread. So he left to go to Moab to try to build a life for his family. So my question to start the class off with is, have you ever left God to seek help? Because that's exactly what Elimelech's doing. He's leaving the presence of God in Israel. He's going to the enemy to try to find bread. Have you ever done that? And is anyone willing to talk about it? Maybe you know a guy. Yeah. I mean, the internet exists to basically justify what we already think we know or want to do to begin with, right? Yeah, so that is certainly one way that we sometimes leave God for help. We go to the world, we seek it in the world, maybe because we're looking for an easier path. How else might this play out? Well, another obvious one is, for whatever reason, you're suffering from trauma, you have depression, you're struggling in a number of different ways. People will look to self-medicate. Maybe it starts off with legitimate medication, which is good. Medication can be good, but you start to self-medicate to try to numb the pain, try to forget the pain. You turn to alcohol. You turn to drugs that aren't legitimate drugs. There's a number of ways, that we try to satisfy the fleshly desires in an attempt to numb the pain that we feel in this life. And when we do that, we're looking for help outside of God. Right? And undoubtedly, statistically speaking, there are some of us here tonight who very much know what that feels like. Even more likely, we at least know someone who has struggled with that or who maybe is struggling with that. That's the kind of thing that I think about with this story. Because Elimelech, again, is leaving the presence of God, and he's going to seek help away from God among God's enemies. Okay, who has 3 through 5? All right, got to fix my animations. Okay, so tragedy strikes. They've been living in Moab for 10 years. And what's interesting, it doesn't explicitly say this. You kind of have to figure it out on your own. You're reading the story and you realize, wait a minute, why do Naomi and Ruth not have children? That seems unusual given the time period, right? Family was everything. Having children was everything. Like all of the rules around, like inheritance and that sort of thing, all based on having children. And here they've lived in Moab for 10 years and they don't have children. What kind of stories come to mind from the Bible that prominently feature women not having children? There's usually something going on there, right? God's trying to prove a point. Or maybe, he's made them barren for whatever reason. Maybe it's because of something they did. Maybe it's because of something he wants them to learn. I am a believer that that's what's going on here. God did not bless them with children for a reason. And on top of that, all the men died. Elimelech and his 2 sons are dead. So we have 3 women living on their own, no children to help support them and take care of them in their old age. And so Naomi's left without any means of support because her daughter-in-laws, in fact, are not obligated to help her. And so my question for you on this is, what does this teach us about leaving God? Because remember, we said Naomi and Elimelech left God to go find help in the world. And this is the situation they end up in. Okay? Yeah, I mean, all of the promises that he made to Israel over and over again around, if you do this, I will do this. If you stay with me, if you worship me, if you love me, if you make me your king, I will do all these things for you. Yeah, so that is one thing it teaches us, Will.
And out daughters,
Yeah,
and so he goes from being a happy woman when she was living in Bethlehem. He calls her husband to Moab. Everything that was there is not there.
yeah. That's a good point. So the way I kind of look at this is there's 2 things that can be happening when we go to the world to seek help apart from God. There could be punishment. God could punish us. Or it could just be that your life is not sustained apart from God. He is the giver of life. He is the sustainer of life. All the good and perfect things we have come from him. If you seek help outside of his presence, then you don't have that sustenance anymore, right? And I think that that's what we're seeing here. What was it that her name meant, Will? Beautiful? Happiness or sweetness. So she's gone from happiness to bitterness, right?
And later on,
Yeah.
and
We're going to get there.
sorry.
We are going to get there. So the overarching message here is that faith trusts in God. Elimelech didn't trust in God in the beginning of the story. He took his family away from God, and here we see the effects of that. Living outside of his presence, they do not have his blessing. All right, so let's talk about Naomi's return. Who has 6 through 10? Okay, so this passage is all about Naomi's decision. She learns that God has rescued his people from famine, right? What's the problem? That's great news, but what's the problem for Naomi? She doesn't live there anymore. She is in the wrong place. God's blessing is being showered on those who are still in his presence. She is outside of his presence, right? And so she has not received God's salvation. Now it's interesting, in the ESV version of this passage, it uses the word return 4 times. It says, return from Moab, return to Judah, return to your mother's house, return to your people. If you want God's provisions, safety, blessings, forgiveness, you must do what? Return. You got to return to God. When the Bible uses a word over and over again like that, it wants you to pay attention to it. That's what we have to do if we want God's blessing, and we are in the wrong place. And really, that's the question I had, is what's the significance of the word return? Any other thoughts on this before we move on to the next passage? All right, who has 11 through 14?
Naomi replied, "Go back home, my daughter. There's no good I no longer take you Go back home, my daughter. I'm too old to marry. Even if I thought that there was hope that I could get married, I decided to keep until you would not want to wait until you're old married. Surely you would not remain married all that time. No, my daughter, you must return with me for my suffering. You must bear, for the Lord is afflicted." Again they wept loudly, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law's side, but Ruth clung tight.
Okay, so we have here an emotional farewell between Naomi and at least with Orpah, right? And there's some reason for this. There's a hopelessness that kind of evades the story here. Naomi says there is no more hope. And the reason for that is because there are 3 women living on their own. They don't have a way of starting another family. The way it's supposed to work is, if, let's just use Ruth for an example, Ruth marries one of Naomi's sons, he dies, she is to marry another one, a brother of her husband, and that portion of inheritance that went to her first husband would go to her offspring, right? That's the way it's supposed to work. But Naomi says, look, even if I married somebody today and we tried to have kids, it's just not going to happen. Are you going to wait around for these kids to grow up to then marry them? Like, there is no path towards stability and safety that she can see. And in fact, she goes as far as to say that this is the work of the Lord, that the Lord's hand is against her. And so we see Orpah is like, good point, I'm out. And she goes home. And that's, in fairness, what Naomi wanted, because she was like, I can't help you. I can't do anything for you. But Ruth, on the other hand, does not give up. And of course, this is a very important story for us. We can learn a lot from Ruth. This is why it's in the Bible here. But I want us to take a moment to think through this. Have you ever felt God's hand against you? Naomi was confident, this is the Lord. His hand is against me. He's the one who caused this to happen. Have you ever felt that way in your life? That the Lord has caused something to happen? While you're thinking about it, I would say probably the way I worded it is incorrectly. I don't know that God is up there going, I'm going to get you, Theron. It's more like what Zach was talking about, where when you're outside of the presence of God, you're away from his blessings and his protection. And when you're trying to carve your own path, we're not good at doing that as humans. We invariably take ourselves somewhere where we shouldn't be. But have you ever felt that way? The truth of the matter and then the way you feel about it sometimes can be separate things. That's a good point. I think the Psalms of David would support that idea. He uses a lot of very powerful imagery, like being ground into the dust of death, where he's gotten himself into a situation where the weight of the gravity of it is just crushing him down into the ground. Any other thoughts, Dan? Yeah, no, that's a really good point. I have 100% felt that way. I think I've shared before that I grew up in an abusive household and suffered a lot of trauma as a child growing up, and then had very similar trauma as a parent in that next phase of my life, and I very much felt like I even prayed it often. Why? Why? Why do I have to go through this twice? Like, isn't once enough? I'm trying to do everything that I know how to do that's right. I know I'm not doing it all right, but I'm trying. Like, why are you doing this to me again? And one of the things that I found was that it helped me to actually just say it to God. You start talking about the way you feel about things. A couple of things can happen. You feel heard, but then also maybe you hear it differently. That was one of the real aha moments for me when I started going to a therapist, was like saying out loud some of the things that happened to me when I was a kid, and then the therapist being like, well, does that sound normal to you? No, it does not. Why am I so worked up about it? That wasn't my fault, kind of thing. Will, you had your hand up? Well, and it could be that he's preparing you to be of service to him in a way you never, ever would have imagined or even asked for, right? At some point, to Shaney's point, too, being able to provide comfort to someone, providing the same comfort that you were given, give it to someone else. I want to read just a little bit from Psalm 22, and just transparency, I'll probably talk about this on Sunday for the Lord's Supper, but it starts off as saying, my God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from saving me? I have a hard time reading this without getting emotional. From the words of my groaning, oh my God, I cry by day, but you do not answer, and by night, but I find no rest. I mean, these are powerful words that David has written here. Like, can you imagine talking to God? Like, why haven't you answered me? Why haven't you heard me? Why aren't you doing anything right now? Do you not see me suffering? And I share this because this psalm in particular really opened my eyes to the fact that you can talk to God. You can say these things to him. David is a man after God's own heart. This is how he talked to God. Even more importantly, and more fascinating about this psalm is this is not only about David, this is about Jesus. Jesus said, my God, why have you forsaken me? Right? He wanted the listeners to go back to the psalm and read and understand that he was the Messiah. That all the things that David felt and was experiencing, Jesus was experiencing too. And so it only stands to reason that we're going to feel pain and suffering, and we're going to feel like we've been forsaken when we really haven't been. But it's important to get those emotions out and talk to God about it. Right.
You don't know finding
Yeah, I agree. I think that's definitely a big part of it. Yeah. Mm. That's powerful. And you know what makes me think of every time I read that passage is when we are begging God to end whatever it is we're going through, we're basically saying, I'm no longer interested in your power being made perfect in my suffering. Right? And you've seen it before. You may have experienced yourself. People will say, oh, you're going through that? I had no idea you're going through that. How are you doing it? Oh, well, God sustains me. And then you just give glory and honor to his name. His power was made perfect in that weakness. So when we ask for it to stop, we're saying, okay, use somebody else, right? Yeah, I love that passage. All right, let's see here. We have 2 more slides. Who has 16 through 18?
But with that, entreat me not to leave you, or to turn back from following after. For wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you I will love. Your people shall be my people, your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. The Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts you and me. Naomi saw that she was going to go with him.
All right, so here this is all about faithfulness and sacrifice. Faithful love that was displayed by a Gentile. And Ruth says, I'm going to go wherever you go. I'm going to die wherever you die. And your God will be my God. And so my question for us to consider is, does God see this kind of devotion from us? God may say to you, I need you to go into this land of suffering for a time because I have plans for you. And you will be useful to me when you get out on the other side. Do we say to him, I will go wherever you tell me to go. I will die wherever you tell me to die. I know in my life I haven't always done that. It's difficult. It's very difficult. But we see this example in Ruth. Ruth would have had an easier life, or at least it would have been logical for her to think she had an easier life if she'd stayed in Moab. Any thoughts on this, Dan? Yeah. Ooh, that's a really good point. I like that. I hope I remember that for the next class. Next, I don't have a pen. Someone write it down for me. No, that's an excellent point. She went there and came back with someone who was faithful and who has been an example of faith throughout history. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, I'm definitely going to remember that. Good point, Dan. Thank you. Like I said, my favorite part of teaching is what you all teach me. So, all right, we have one last slide. Okay, Jacob. Okay, so we close out this chapter with Naomi and Ruth coming back and to Bethlehem, and everyone. So they came back to the house of bread because there was now bread in the house. Everyone was stirred up by it. Everyone was talking. Wait a minute, is that Naomi? I thought we would never see her again. I'm so excited that she's back. And who's that? She's got a Moabite woman with her? Like, what's going on? Where's Elimelech? There was probably all kinds of activity around her being back. But she says, don't call me Naomi, call me Mara. Why does she want to be called Mara? Yeah, she lost everything. And she's bitter. Yeah, exactly. Tony, were you going to say something? Same thing? Yeah. And so they come back. It's the beginning of the harvest, which represents this hope that God has provided, right? Because he is the one that's allowed the harvest. And so my kind of final question for us to think about in the last few minutes here is, What does this teach us about grief? Yeah, so I kind of think about this like she's very open to me. Like it strikes me when I read this part of the chapter, this like, wow, she's really kind of open and upfront about what's going on here. Don't call me Naomi anymore. I'm Mara, and the reason I'm Mara is because I'm bitter, and the reason I'm bitter is because God made me bitter. He brought me back empty, and He afflicted me, right? Misfortune from God. God did this to me. But she's very open about it. At the same time, she's also coming back to God. She knows that that's where she needs to be. She knows that that's where the blessings are. And I know I've kind of made this point already, but I just want to reiterate this idea that it's okay to feel your feelings. Like that's something I try to tell everybody all the time because I spent 50 plus years suppressing my feelings, and it has done terrible things to me, physically and mentally. And so I want to just share with you that it's okay. Feel what you feel. It's okay for her to talk out loud and say that God has brought her back empty. She at least acknowledges God is in control, and she is on her way back to Him, right? So don't feel like, I think we sometimes get caught up in this idea that if we think any of these negative type thoughts, then our faith was never real in the first place, and it just like compounds itself. Feel what you feel, but the bottom line here is that when you're grieving, make sure you're headed back to God. Mike? It can be. Absolutely, that's right. Okay, last question here for you to think about is, can you trust God more deeply than you do? Just try to maybe think about that the rest of this week. Aaron?
Steve, I'm going to speak up loud so the